think I'll start with saying I'm tired.
Tired.
I'm really, really tired.
Me too, girl.
I didn't know what to write ahead of today, even though I was constantly thinking about the words to say. I first want to make sure that I gave credit where it was due. I think it starts with acknowledging the emotional and physical support that Jalen and Mimi have been able to provide myself this week. But knowing that we always had each other, no matter how overwhelmed, exhausted, or absolutely defeated we may have felt. I also want to acknowledge those who didn't just make their presence physically known today, but have provided their resources, time, their listening ears and shoulders to cry on for their Black friends and Black peers. We felt your effect, but it can also be seen all around you right now. This was not just efforts of us organizers, but efforts of a community. Taking me to my first thought. Community has been a critical pillar in my life, meaning I have been self-resourceful and I've gotten things done myself, but I can't deny just how much the community has gotten me to the place I am today. The movement cannot survive unless we're a community, sharing resources, educating ourselves, and being in spaces that challenge our collective mindsets and force us to be uncomfortable. Change and reform does not come to those who sit idly by. This moment, this protest, is cultivated from over 400 years of resistance and disruption. But this is it. This is that moment. This movement is short of temporary, but it is happening, and it is happening quickly. This moment where we stand right now is just a pin in a timeline of history and the resilience of Black people in our struggle. We are taking steps forward. We are saying their names. We're taking our breaths. But what are we going to do after? After today? I think the one thing that's come to my thoughts most is, what do I do after today? What do us as organizers do after today? What does the university do? What do my friends and fellow community members do after today? What are you going to do? One of the common phrases that I've been getting from lots of my friends, more specifically white ones, is, what should I do now? Once they've attended protests, signed petitions, donated to Black organizations, even ordered takeout from a local Black restaurant, they still come to me and ask, what should I do now? And to be honest, I really hate that question. This sort of work is something that is never done, but most of all, something that applies to all mediums of life. Black lives are not a trend. My livelihood is not seasonal.
Period!
Black lives are not something you can reduce to hashtags or last words. Our lives are not something you can prioritize some of the time.
That's right.
Black voices cannot be silent because even when we're screaming, we are muffled. We're still muffled. We have to walk because you couldn't see us before, but we're making for damn sure you can see us right now. We continue this work because it is never finished, and we have to continue to what lies after. After today, I'm going to rest. I'm going to get right back up again tomorrow, though, and do my work all over again.
That's right.
We cannot stop after today. Today is just one step in many towards the livelihoods for my children, their children, and if the earth isn't melted by then, theirs too. We have much more than ourselves at stake. We must think of after as something much more progressive. We have to take our thoughts of after and not apply them to the moment or tomorrow or to next week, but walk forward with our prolonged futures in mind. This country will not be able to handle a wave stronger than the one hitting them now. But if we need to make it happen, so be it. We must take our thoughts and actions and make them more intentional, knowing that what we do today affects tomorrow in tenfold. So as you walk today, tomorrow, and next week, think about how you're working for this after. What does it look like? What does it feel like? But most of all, what is different? What are you going to do after? Thank you.
I'm encouraged by what is happening in the world right now. That we see so many youth and college students and parents who are out there saying Blacks matter, that we have not seen before. And they're still there. And so I'm encouraged by the youth being there, that perhaps we have set the goal for them. This is going to be their life. They're going to live in the United States. How are they going to live in the United States? And what do they want from it? And if we as educators have done our job, they will make and have made a commitment that Black Lives Matter. And they're doing it, and they're doing it right now. As we are talking, as I'm sitting here doing nothing, that they're out there doing something. And that's encouraging to me.
The historical perspective of engagement around civil rights, past and present. So the past was more violent. More people were actually shot and killed point blank. It was much more fascist. Just look at the most recent highlights about the life of John Lewis on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And those are the things that were done in daylight with cameras. Just imagine what was done in the North, the South, the West, the amount of physical tragedy and death that wasn't reported. So it's much more violent in the past than it is now. Communication is so different. We were leaflets, hand to mouth, door to door. Now we have these communication platforms where folks can organize in a different way. And I think that whole communications platform from television to Instagram shows why there's a much broader representation in the struggle. That old people, young people of different backgrounds and races and ethnicities and religions, it is a quilt that's knitted a lot, a quilt that is woven a lot tighter today than it was in the past. And there is more hope.
America has torn itself apart through racism against Black people since they were first brought to this country in chains. Black people came to Tacoma in the late 1800s seeking a new life, but lived with few rights. They faced limited opportunities due to the deep-rooted discrimination and common prejudices of the white people in Tacoma. In 1911, several prominent thinkers and organizers founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, in New York City. Their mission included, quote, to promote equality of rights and to eradicate caste or race prejudice among the citizens of the United States. Chapters of the organization soon began to spread across the country. Who would have the courage to work to improve their lives? Dr. Nettie Craig Asberry, 1865 to 1968. Dr. Nettie Asberry taught piano to generations of students, but she was no mere piano teacher. She earned a PhD in music when few African Americans could attend college due to discrimination, and she worked her whole life against racial inequality. Social issues deeply concerned Dr. Asberry, and in 1913 she founded in Tacoma the first chapter of the NAACP west of the Rocky Mountains. One of her early actions was to challenge a measure against interracial marriage that legislators were trying to pass at the state capitol. As she described her method, quote, "We had an underground worker there who let us know, and overnight we got together a caravan of several cars of people of several races, white, colored, Filipino, and others. We descended on the powerful Rules Committee as a surprise and defeated the measure." End quote. In 1916, Tacoma anticipated the premiere of a racist and violent, yet highly successful movie, D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. A meeting of concerned citizens chose Dr. Asberry to write a letter protesting the movie's coming to Tacoma, as they did not like the way it represented Black people. Dr. Asberry had already seen it in California, and she expressed her frustration in writing after seeing the film. She said, quote, "I was in a fighting mood. No one can witness the production of this movie and be the same as before he saw it." End quote. Continuing her work, Dr. Asberry fought against segregation at Fort Lewis and in Tacoma's theaters, protested mistreatment by store and restaurant workers, and wrote many letters to the newspaper to argue against discrimination. As she grew older, she remained committed to working for social justice, stayed active in Black women's clubs, and volunteered countless hours to make her city a better place for all. In 1943, the NAACP named her one of the first ladies of colored America. Throughout her life, Dr. Asberry also worked to spread the joy of music. In 1902, she founded the Mozart Musical Club for young people, and in 1968, the year that she died, donated musical instruments and library materials for a hilltop music hall named in her honor. During her career, she had spent over 50 years teaching piano lessons to students of all colors. Dr. Asberry received many honors throughout her life for her commitment to social justice and for bringing music to so many. She knew solving the problems of our society would take longer than her lifetime, but she never gave up. When interviewed at age 96, she insisted that courage is, quote, "the saving grace in this tense world racial situation." Dr. Nettie Asberry's courage to fight for what she believed in should inspire every generation of Tacoma citizens.
Mother gave me these manuscripts, and then when I started researching all of them, I said, wow, this is Aunt Nettie. You know, I just take a train ride from Oakland up to Tacoma, and she was Aunt Nettie. And she had this really strong personality. You know, you just knew when she was in the room. You didn't fool around. You were on your best behavior because she was pretty insistent about what she believed in. And so then I began to uncover all these newspaper articles and things that they wrote about her in different books. And I began to research her history. And I just found it fascinating. But, you know, when you're in a family, sometimes, you're just part of that family. And I guess I just didn't, when they were talking about it, I didn't really absorb it because they didn't make a point of it. And so then I thought, wow, this is very interesting. Her siblings, her uncles and all of them who were enslaved and who owned them, who turns out to be my biological great-grandfather, but he was their enslaver, and so my point is coming from that to where she got in Tacoma, quite an accomplishment. And she was the only out of her mother's first 8 children, she was the only one free and born free. And so, you know, I feel like she didn't want things to continue to happen according to what she saw before. And I think that was one reason why she was such a strong civil rights activist. You know, she'd seen what had happened to her mother, she'd seen what happened to her, her older siblings and her aunts and uncles and her grandmother. They were all enslaved. And so I think she had this determination to make sure that, to get away from those kinds of things.
Quoting from the Puyallup tribal history, "Our people lived here for thousands of years, existing by the bountiful gifts provided by the Creator. Our environment was rich in the wealth of natural resources, providing all our needs, allowing us to live healthy, happy lives." End quote. No dogs or Indians. Businesses posted this sign on their doors well into the 1940s and 50s. The doors of the buildings that stood on the land that had sustained Native Americans since the time no one can remember. The land the government had violently removed them from. The land that pollution and industry devastated. Our country had worked to destroy the Native American way of life for hundreds of years, and by the 1960s, life was bleak for the Puyallup tribe of Indians. They had no clear claim to their land and no appropriate health care, education, or housing. Not surprisingly, disease, alcoholism, drug use, and suicide ran throughout the community. Deprived of their traditions, faced with crushing racism, and over half the tribe living in poverty, how would their culture survive? Who would stand up to the government and demand what they were owed? How would the Puyallup tribe find an empowering way forward? Ramona Bennett, 1938 to the present. Ramona Bennett of the Puyallup tribe played one of the most important roles in the rebirth of her tribe. From day-to-day issues to major protests, Ms. Bennett has devoted herself to achieving her people's rights. Ms. Bennett was first elected to the Puyallup Tribal Council in 1968, when the tribe had no recognized land base, services, or rights. The tribe's enrollment had not been certified since 1929, so there were very few recognized members of the tribe. Ms. Bennett took part in one of her first major actions during the fish-in on the Puyallup River in 1970. Puyallup tribal members set up a camp on the river because they knew they had a right to fish there, even though the state government said they did not. Eventually, state officials attacked the camp and assaulted the hundreds of people there, including Puyallup tribal members and their many supporters from outside the tribe. In the end, Judge Bolt determined that the state government had acted wrongly. The Puyallup tribe has the right to their river and to keep 50% of the fish harvest every year. As Ms. Bennett described the tribe's connection to the river, quote, "Our religion is that we are put here to protect our brothers and sisters, the salmon. If we fail in that responsibility, we're done as Indians. The fishing rights struggle was a fight for cultural and spiritual survival." End quote. Besides serving on the tribal council for many years, Ms. Bennett was elected tribal chairwoman in 1971 and served until 1979. In 1976, she led a successful takeover and occupation of a building on land that rightfully belonged to the tribe. In addition to protest actions and managing tribal affairs, Ms. Bennett co-wrote the Federal Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978 and founded Rainbow Youth and Family Service in 1988. Under Ms. Bennett's leadership and in the years that followed, the tribe built facilities, created programs, provided services, opened clinics and schools, started businesses, and more. In 1988, the Puyallup tribe agreed to a $162 million settlement with the state of Washington. Ms. Bennett views the tribe as rising from the ashes and inspiring the next generation. In reflecting on all of the challenges while fighting for her tribe, Ms. Bennett said, "But you know, that's how Creator works. You just get tested. What can you endure? You know if you endure just a little bit more, you will get it done." The Puyallup tribe has endured much more than anyone deserves, and the struggle continues. But Ms. Ramona Bennett's determination will continue to lead the way.
The only thing I could ever add is how just deeply thankful I am to my ancestors and to my elders for what I, as a sort of amateur historian, I guess, I am constantly learning how hard and how much that work was, and how often it was unrecognized, and it is unrecognized to this day, and it's very humbling and also very inspiring. Just that how much the little work that seems little, seems unrecognized, seems sort of reading all those policies, reading all those laws, it's so annoying and painful, is really a lot of where that work gets done. And I just am constantly amazed and again humbled by our ancestors and elders. Probably the largest one, of course, is going to be the LNG plant, and how that is affecting and going to affect our land, our population, and our natural resources. But having said that, there's always just the larger concern of Puyallup and Indigenous sovereignty, how we're able to take care of our people in an ongoing fight against Indigenous sovereignty. It's constantly it's constantly being chipped away at. And I think the LNG, and I think really all of the larger fights that we've seen, are always just representative of our leaders looking at the ways that our nationhood and our self-determination is being chipped away at in very small ways, and also very large, much larger ways as well. For a lot of Indigenous scholars and Indigenous activists, an astounding thing, I think, is just in the recent couple of weeks where the Washington football team has decided to change its name to the Washington football team. People either have racism or they have nothing, I guess. Which, Indigenous activists, especially, it's been very women-led, have been fighting for that name change for the last probably 25 years in all sorts of really interesting, really fantastic ways. But it was really the BLM movements that tipped that scale in this way that I don't think a lot of us saw coming. And even if you go back into the fish wars in the 60s, we were working, my elders were working very closely with the Black Panther Party, back and forth, learning things, adapting it to Indigenous methodologies, as well as, and vice versa, right? So one of the things I think that we see is that one of the most important things is solidarity across our different marginalized communities, and without that, it's much more difficult, and a lot more disheartening. Whereas we can get a lot of motivation, we can learn a lot, even if we are in separate struggles. There is a wealth of knowledge that comes from solidarity across marginalized peoples.
Every Saturday in Detroit, I went roller skating. I loved to roller skate. But it was a segregated affair. I never paid any attention. The white kids roller skated to an organ and they had a ball over at, I forget the name of their roller rink, but the black roller rink was called the Paradise Bowl. And we roller skated to popular music. And it was a blast. It was just wonderful. And so when I got to Tacoma, my first trip into Tacoma on the GI bus that took you down was I saw a roller skating rink over on Pacific Avenue. I jumped up, pulled a cord, got off that bus in my uniform, and made a beeline for the ticket office.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I all of a sudden I was at home until the young lady said, "Just a minute, please." And that's when your heart falls. You know that there's something going on. And the gentleman comes up, and he's just as nice as he could be. And he explained to me that the coloreds are invited to come on Wednesdays, but we don't have mixed white and black
Wow.
skaters. And if you come back on Wednesday, we'll be very happy. Here I'm standing in my uniform and turned away from that window and started down the street. And it occurred to me that I'm going to fight for somebody else's freedom and could get killed. That you know, at that stage of the game, well, I made teeth for a living, so I had been taken out of the artillery and placed in a dental laboratory where I was needed more than, you know, a lineman. And but it occurred to me then that I'm being trained to kill somebody who has never denied me the right to roller skate with them.
Right.
Never called me out of my name, never abused me, and my list went on and on and on. By the time I got back to Fort Lewis, I was a pretty angry soldier. So that was kind of the first real experience of racism in Tacoma.
Harold G. Moss, 1929 to the present. Mr. Harold Moss has faced many trials in his life, denied positions he was qualified for, refused service at restaurants, stopped from purchasing properties, judged at first glance. Why? Simply the color of his skin. As a black man in Tacoma, Mr. Moss has experienced significant discrimination, but has never given up fighting against it. After leaving the Army, Mr. Moss stayed in Tacoma to work as a denturist, making false teeth. He also heavily involved himself in civil rights work, including the Tacoma NAACP. The NAACP worked tirelessly to end the illegal yet traditional discrimination in Tacoma. Eventually, Mr. Moss realized that to really make change, he had to find a more powerful position in city government. In 1969, he decided to run for city council. He had helped calm the Mother's Day disturbance earlier that year and had helped Tom Dixon found the Urban League the year before, but a white candidate defeated him. He did not lack support, however, and after 5 council members were removed from office by voters in 1970, Mr. Moss was appointed to a seat. He was the first black man to serve on the Tacoma City Council. Mr. Moss believes his presence on the City Council helped members think about issues that would not have occurred to them before. Along with Jack Warnick, he called for a strong Human Rights Commission ordinance and an affirmative action plan. In 1989, as the City Council wrote anti-discrimination rules, he insisted they include protection for homosexuals and others discriminated against. He told the council, "We proposed to extend rights to fellow human beings to experience the liberties we claim are everybody's right." In 1994, Moss served as deputy mayor to the newly elected Jack Hyde. Mr. Hyde died suddenly after only 2 weeks in office. Mr. Moss became Tacoma's first black mayor. Judge Jack Tanner swore in Mr. Moss as mayor, and again when he became the first black man on the Pierce County Council. As mayor, Mr. Moss focused on crime prevention, economic development, and civil rights. Regardless of the challenges he faced as a black man working in politics, Mr. Moss knew he had to fight for civil rights. As he wrote in his autobiography, "But what makes a black person want to risk humiliation and political death? The answer is that we are citizens of this great nation too, and have faith in its future for all of us. Political involvement is a dream worth fighting for. Dreams matter." End quote. Mr. Moss has impressed those around him and inspired a new generation of black politicians. Ernest Brazil called on young people to look up to Mr. Moss because, quote, he put his life on the line. He put the job on the line. He would take a stand for what he believed in. Thomas Dixon said of Mr. Moss, "By virtue of his presence, we get the impression that we're going to make it in Tacoma. The Moss magic that makes Mr. Harold Moss able to find solutions and support for the city's dreams will motivate generations to come." The civil rights movement of the 1960s deeply affected the entire country. In Tacoma, black people continued to endure housing discrimination, living in neighborhoods that were falling apart, a lack of a say in politics, and few economic opportunities. While there was no legal segregation, for example, whites-only drinking fountains, white people still excluded African Americans from many parts of the community, including preventing them from buying or renting housing outside of Tacoma's Hilltop neighborhood. Many in the city feared that the violence in other parts of the country surrounding racial issues would erupt in Tacoma. The mayor and the city council were very conservative and worked against programs designed to help the city deal with poverty and racism. The black community knew that it was time for a change in Tacoma, as black people and their allies fought for change across the United States. Harold Moss, then of the NAACP Youth Council, warned Tacoma that when young people suffer inequality, quote, an explosion is just around the corner, end quote. The anger in the Hilltop community came to a head one night in 1969, and what came to be known as a Mother's Day disturbance. An attempted arrest of a black man led to angry confrontations with the police, vandalism, and destruction of property. The police officers were accused of brutality, and one officer was shot and wounded in the conflict. The black leadership of Tacoma knew that they had to respond to this incident quickly to prevent violence. Thomas Dixon, Harold Moss, James Walton, Reverend Ernest Brazil, and others managed to calm down the community. Reverend Brazil described, "When I was coming home from church, they were all lined up and down the street. The police said, 'Would you say something? And we will back you up and try to settle it.' We just asked them if they'd go home, because if they stayed on the street, they would have gotten into a riot." Mr. Dixon later explained, "We are sure that had it not been for us, there would have been a bloodbath and death in Tacoma." Following the disturbance, black leaders met with the city council and demanded increased neighborhood services and representation on the police force and in the fire department. They eventually achieved these goals. The mayor soon lost his bid for re-election, and the citizens of Tacoma removed 5 city council members from office. Tacoma's African Americans continued to worry about their community and saw a strong need for action. They formed the Tacoma Black Collective as a regular opportunity to address the concerns and issues of the black community. Since 1970, they have met every Saturday, every week of the year. Any black person may attend to listen and to be heard. The Mother's Day riot brought the black community together, and we've been together ever since 1969, says Thomas Dixon.
It was home. It was the African American community that I had left in Chicago had reinvented itself here in Tacoma, and I have always been lucky. I mean, not just lucky, but profoundly lucky, because there was no design that I knew of that would have this organization come about. And there was no plan that I would connect myself to the Black Collective. But there I did around 1970 and 71. And they started around 68. And to this day, I'm still seen sometimes as a newcomer. So quite often it's identified that I helped to create the Black Collective. It was created when I showed up under different auspices and different names. And if you want to get into that, I'd be happy to roll you back into that. But what we did is that we found a community that was not built on hierarchy. And I think what you see in, especially in the Midwest, East Coast, in some cases, West Coast, but it is a hierarchy, and you have people who are individuals of note. They are doctors or lawyers or elected to political office, folks with high academic achievement. There is a social stratification in the Black community. Much of that did not exist in Tacoma. Much of that did not exist when I came to this group of people, where we saw folks with PhDs sitting next to people with GEDs. And I said, home, this is home. And we started to look at what the objective realities were in our community as it related to race. And Tacoma and Pierce County failed to get a passing mark in any category that you might name. No box was ticked. Was it housing? No. Racial bias. Was it transportation? No. Racial bias. Was it healthcare? No. Racial bias. Was it education? No. Racial bias. You just could not find a situation in Tacoma and or Pierce County where most of the principles that people who engage in the civic arena would think were equitable, healthy, civic, democratic engagement. And there were basically two groups of people that we had to deal with. Folks who did not understand or appreciate their support of institutional racism, and those who did understand and appreciate institutional racism. And those are the two major categories. And there were people who were sympathetic to Black folks, but none of whom I think were willing to put their economic people were okay unless the price was too high to pay. If it affected their home, their house, their job, they saw engagement of the Black community as a zero-sum game. That anything that we received took something from them, and they were willing to give up some things, but not much. And so we did have some people who were significantly sympathetic, but not particularly engaged to the point where they would appreciate or understand any sacrifices that they would have to make in order to make this move. And so this was us.
It didn't happen overnight, and this position where you weren't particularly wanted and you face many challenges, but something had to break. And the knowledge that I was there at the right time is gratifying. But what's more important, Kim, is that those who followed. And being the first is not easy, because you're sitting in positions where you're not particularly wanted. You go into meetings where your opinion is not particularly valued, but you stay. And you fight the forces, not fight literally, of course, but you disagree readily with some of the forces being presented to you. And people think that you're crazy. But you keep that foot, you keep the knowledge, you keep saying it over and over again and again. Hopefully someone will start listening and do something about it. While on the city council, I represented the hilltop area, which had low value as far as the city was concerned. And while I represented hilltop, I kept pushing and pushing and pushing and saying, we are a part of the city. And someone should be able to listen. So one of the things that happened, I asked the city council to meet on Hilltop, and once leaving there, go visit. Walk through the alleys and see if this is clean. Have you done your responsibility as living? And they came back to me and said, thank you, Dolores. No, we haven't. We have ignored some of the forces that we see. And sometimes you just have to see it for yourself before you realize the neglect.
Thomas Dixon, 1931 to present. The grandson of a slave who made sure all of his 18 children received an education, and the son of a doctor who devoted his life to helping others. In his career, Mr. Thomas Dixon has lived up to that legacy. At first, Mr. Dixon was not sure what he wanted to do with his life. He served in the Air Force for 13 years, was discharged, and stayed in Tacoma. Still trying to figure out a career, friends helped him find a job working for the Office of Economic Opportunity. In that position, he set up service centers around Tacoma, headed the Hilltop Neighborhood Improvement Council, and worked with the city on youth programs. Reflecting on his accomplishments in 1979, Mr. Dixon told a reporter, quote, "There was no connection in those days between the black community and the other areas of power in Tacoma. We set something up that stands today," end quote. As racial tensions increased in the 1960s, Mr. Dixon and a number of Tacoma citizens looked for a way to help the situation. They formed a Tacoma branch of the Urban League, a national organization that acts to improve the community's employment situation, housing, economic development, health services, and education. Under Mr. Dixon's 32-year leadership, the Urban League achieved many successes and grew to a budget of millions of dollars a year, many employees, numerous projects, and its own building. Their work creates social change. It does not just provide social services. Mr. Dixon insists that one of the Urban League's main strengths is its ability to work with all different community groups. The same can be said for Mr. Dixon. Quote, "He picks up as many people as he can and influences and changes lives in whatever way he can along the way," says Mayor and former Urban League President and CEO Victoria Woodards. Quote, "I just don't think people understand the everyday lives that the Urban League has touched because of Tom Dixon." In 1995, the Tacoma Housing Authority named its new housing development Dixon Village in tribute to Mr. Dixon's work for the community. In 2015, he won the Greater Tacoma Peace Prize, the first African American to receive the award. Despite the recognition and growth, Mr. Dixon knows the work must continue. As he told a reporter in 1999, quote, "Yes, blacks and others have made much progress, but there are still tremendous gaps relative to income, housing status, political participation, and lifestyle. I could go on and on. Tacoma is fortunate that Mr. Thomas Dixon's work has and will continue to go on and on." James Walton, 1939 to the present. Quote, "I never envisioned that I would work for government because I was of the strongly held position and opinion that the one thing that was holding down the black African American community was our government," end quote. Growing up in the segregated South of the 1940s and 50s, Mr. James Walton experienced the power of discrimination firsthand. When Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, Mr. Walton felt called to fight for the rights of black people. After his Army discharge from Fort Lewis, Mr. Walton enrolled at Tacoma Community College, where he became a leader of a group dedicated to improving college life for African American students. Although they faced sometimes dangerous resistance, their actions achieved results. His experience at TCC, his response to the Mother's Day disturbance, and his jobs with urban development showed Mr. Walton that working from within the system can be a powerful way to make change. In 1972, the new city manager offered him the job of executive director of the Tacoma Human Relations Department. At first, he did not want the job, still viewing government as the enemy of the black people. After discussions with friends, Mr. Walton changed his mind. Quote, "I wanted me and other African Americans to be part of the system that runs things," end quote, he decided. "My goal was to be an insider." As the director of the Human Relations Department, Mr. Walton ran the city's affirmative action program and worked to challenge discrimination in Tacoma. He ended up working for the city for 34 years and became known as a calm, thoughtful man of honor. During his years at the city, he created or ran many programs that improved neighborhoods, health, equal opportunity, and employment for people of color and low-income populations. Mr. Walton became Tacoma's first black city manager in 2003. The city council had fired the previous city manager due to scandal. The council nearly did not choose Mr. Walton for the job because of untrue rumors that he was involved in the scandal. Times were difficult at City Hall, but Mr. Walton handled the chaotic situation, according to those around him, with integrity, compassion, and, importantly, openness. Upon his retirement, council member Tom Stenger told him, quote, "Through your strength of character and your leadership skills, you pulled us out of quite a crisis," end quote. Mr. Walton has remained active in the Black Collective ever since that dangerous night in 1969. He views his work with the collective as some of the most important of his life. He told a reporter in 2016, quote, "It is a way to pay things forward. I think our future is much more promising than our history has been glorious. To see the young people who are emerging as public servants, that gives me great hope for the community, the African American community, and the collective." Mr. Walton's powerful work to change the system from the inside gives us hope that government can make people's lives better.
Hilltop is being recognized as part of the city, which it wasn't in the past. And so I feel good about that. Additionally, just sitting on the city council, having it televised and viewed by many, that said, if she can do it, so can I. And so that was a nonverbal thing that I recognized. And that she puts your best foot forward, and your appearance is important. That not only that you say it, but you look the part. People judge you even before you open your mouth, by how you look, unfortunately.
Yes.
And we all look different. But that's a judgment that we have to recognize it's happening in all over the world, not just Tacoma.
Right.
That if I walk down the street, I am a Black female. I'm not a member of the city council. I am a Black female. And with all of the connotations that go with that, just as we are experiencing these problems today.
Right.
Just being Black. And you may have the best education in the world. You may live in the best house in the world, but you're still Black. Which means that there are restrictions on you.
When it comes to things like changing the world or trying to be revolutionary, it's like you can't be silent about it. You can't, be timid. You have to be big and you have to be open and you have to make sure that people know, So I think it's been really inspiring looking back on past activists and past writers, especially, and seeing how they apply theory in the modern day, especially as a way for me to approach activism today.
Dennis Flannigan, 1939 to present. Dennis Flannigan first took significant action to help others when he joined the 1964 Freedom Summer Campaign. He traveled from his hometown of Tacoma after leaving the University of Puget Sound all the way to Mississippi to help register African Americans to vote. Other people had been murdered for that kind of action, but Mr. Flannigan felt it was something he had to do. Mr. Flannigan returned to Tacoma with a drive to continue to help disadvantaged people. He co-founded the Pierce County Alliance, which helps those struggling with drug addiction, and founded the Emergency Food Network, which works to ensure that no one goes hungry. Mr. Flannigan was elected to the Pierce County Council in 1987, where he served 10 years. The other members of the council called him its conscience, because he had always made sure they thought about the poor. In January 1989, as violence seemed a hopeless problem, the citizens of Hilltop held a prayer vigil to call out for help. Later that month, Mr. Flannigan organized more than 1,000 community members to come together in the Foss High School gym. He knew the leaders of Tacoma would not be able to solve the problem by themselves. Quote, "We didn't know what to do. It seemed to be a battle the police couldn't win by themselves. Schools couldn't win by themselves. We needed to engage the community because no one group could win alone," end quote. At the meeting, community members discussed the problems and started collaborating on plans to take back their city. This action became the Safe Streets campaign. Safe Streets is now a large and wide-ranging network of organizations and neighborhood groups that help citizens make their communities safer. Tom Dixon of the Tacoma Urban League says that, quote, "If Safe Streets were not in Tacoma, we'd be a lot worse off than we are today," end quote. In 2002, the people of the 27th District elected Mr. Flannigan as their representative to the Washington State Legislature. He served until 2010. Many of his accomplishments for Tacoma have to do with renovation and restoration of public spaces, and he also helped get funding for the Chinese Reconciliation Project Foundation. Reflecting on his career when given an honorary doctorate from the University of Puget Sound, Mr. Flannigan told the audience, "I had no idea what leadership was about. I just knew that there were things that needed to be done." Former Mayor Bill Barsma celebrated Mr. Flannigan as a, quote, "community leader whose fairness, directness, and success have gained him credibility with public and private leaders, elected or not," end quote. A lot has changed in Tacoma since the dark days of the 1980s, and although our city still struggles, the citizens of Tacoma now feel pride and hope. Mr. Dennis Flannigan, with his care for all people, made much of that change happen.
when I was 13, I was mowing the lawn up in the hilltop, 17th and K Street, South K Street, and a property owned by my brother and somebody else. And so I was mowing the lawn in the back, and a woman came out in the back door and just said, "I've made some tuna sandwiches. Can I give you lunch?" And she was African American, a phrase I hadn't heard at that time. And I said, "No, I'm doing fine." But it was primarily because I was hadn't been around Black people very much. I was raised in Browns Point, and you weren't going to find anybody who was Black there. So I knew as I did it that it was wrong, and that in those days I was pretty introverted and afraid of conversations like this. And so as I walked away, I hitchhiked home to Browns Point, and I was raised Catholic, and kind of we're all in this together. That everybody is the same. All of that kind of 10 Commandments and everything else, hit me in the nose, and so that's when I began to do what I did, which is get involved in some way. First at school, just by taking history classes at Jason Lee, I guess, at that time, and continuing to be active. My father had been active in union labor years before I was born. And as things went along at the UPS, it was very closed, tightly closed, and I began to be involved in things and stand up for issues that were some racial and some just stupidity, I guess. So at some point, I published a newspaper called The Braille, and you may have seen it. It sits out at UPS, and Bill Barsman knows about it. And in there, I challenged the school to do better on lots of things. And the president came of the school and said if I did it again, he would throw me out of the school, which seemed like a challenge. And I thought, so we put a second paper out, and he got a vote of 4-4, which allowed his motion to pass, and I was asked to leave the university. At the same time, the war was going on, the Vietnam War, and I was a pacifist. I didn't want to go to there, but I also generally thought along those lines, war's doing no good. But I also thought you got to put yourself in front of something that tests you, not something that avoids something. So I heard of SNCC, and I read some papers from Mississippi and things. And so I signed up, and that took me to Mississippi. And therein began a lot of things that changed my life, as you can imagine.
I think something I've been thinking about a lot more, especially post-protest, it's like, I don't know what it is about visibility, but it's like the way that young people are really magnified, especially when it comes to things like movements and just fighting for rights in general. It's like, I honestly think people our age could easily be revolutionary, and I think a lot of what holds people our age back, or at least in my opinion, is like, it's just being afraid of doing the things that you think big people, the adults, should be doing. And I think when it comes to protesting for your own life, like it doesn't have to be like seniority here, I think everyone is capable of, advocating for themselves, like just in the basic scheme of things, there's reason for young people to be invested in this because it affects your future. Like, I don't see why you shouldn't start young, because it's going to be something that affects me my entire life, so I don't see why not young people start when they can.